Hello and welcome to the Providence College Podcast. I'm Liz Kay and welcome to our final special episode leading up to Election Day 2020. This three-part series was recorded as part of PC Campus Ministries' Reflections for Election Season Sanity. In this podcast, Elise Italiano Ureneck, a PC alum from the class of 2006, discusses friendship, dialogue, and trust, having differing views with friends.
I have to say I was a bit surprised to get the invitation and the topic that I was asked to ask on to provide an answer to the question, can I be friends with someone who has different political views than I do? It's an invitation to address cancel culture, polarization, group identity, which have all made their way onto campus as they have made their way through other spaces in our broader culture. And in reflecting on why I was surprised, I imagine it was due to the fact that many college alumni hold their alma mater in an idyllic esteem. I think for many people, your college gets frozen in time for you. You remember it like it was when you were there. So from 2003 to 2006, there was no iPhone yet. We all communicated, called each other on landlines, or used AOL Instant Messenger to meet up for dinner. There was no Dunkin' Donuts on campus, and we worked out in the basement of Stevenson. More seriously, the world was a lot different, as was Providence College. The only type of cancel culture that I can remember existing on campus was between Yankees and Red Sox fans, which kind of bubbled up in 2004 when the curse of the Bambino was broken. But even those folks found a way to be friends by the time the Super Bowl came around in the winter. Our political, religious, and ideological divisions have reached a critical point. Just last week, I was reading about a new study that revealed people are refusing to date anyone who does not share their political views. In my experience, dating is hard enough without an absolutized approach like this. We know from studies that neighborhoods shaped by income disparities and racial groupings are becoming more homogeneous. Neighbors now share political and cultural viewpoints as well as similar street addresses. And according to several sociologists of religion, we're even self-segmented in Catholic parishes. This means we're increasingly only worshiping alongside of people who think like us, not about faith or the creed or actually the tenets of faith or even liturgical preferences, but also on politics and culture more broadly. The Catholic parish for a long time was at least one of the remaining places where people of all walks of life could encounter one another. Here comes everybody is how James Joyce describes Catholics. Now it's more like, here comes other people like me. The world wasn't always this way, and I believe as any student of history, or Civ should, I'm looking at you, all the Providence students who have made their way through Civ, that life won't always be this way, and that should fill us with great hope. We're certainly in a difficult moment. People are searching for something sure and certain. People have lost faith and trust in a lot of institutions. And in my estimation, politics has become a last-ditch sort of place to put people's faith, or that people are putting their faith and they're looking for saving. Polarization, anxiety, and anxiety seem to be everywhere. Polarization, anger, and anxiety seem to be everywhere. And the reasons for this exceed the scope of this talk, but I want to underscore again that it's not always going to be this way. There's a pretty strong natural inclination in human beings towards peace and communion. And so I think a good approach at this time is to live in light of that fact, that this moment is not the most important moment in all of history, but each moment is one in which we get to define our character. And that's really what gives it a lot of importance. So how is a Christian supposed to approach this moment? How are we supposed to make and maintain friends during a vicious election cycle? Our guide for the remainder of the talk is Pope Francis, who just wrote an encyclical, or a letter, on this very topic. Fratelli Tutti, translated Brothers All, was published on the feast of St. Francis of Assisi on October 4th. And it's a sweeping overview of the Pope's vision for a world that fosters fraternity and social friendship. The main idea is simple. Because we all have the same Father, we each have to consider one another brothers and sisters and treat each other as such. As most people know from family life, you don't always agree with your siblings or parents or extended family. Sometimes you might not even like them, but you are called to love them and live in harmony with them. If you haven't read the encyclical, I encourage you to. It's long, and I don't pretend that college students read things that aren't assigned to them. I don't even pretend that they read all of the things that are assigned to them. But maybe you could make your way through 1 or 2 paragraphs a day, contemplating what he makes of our current situation and suggestions for what a kinder and gentler world could look like. I believe that the campus ministry staff has uploaded a handout with some quotations that I'm going to reference. So if I don't get to all of them, it's just to be mindful of the time. Again, there's plenty for you to read. It's one of his longer letters. So now I'm going to offer you something akin to Pope Francis's top 5 tips for making and maintaining friends during election season. But really, they are 5 points I've tried to use as a communications professional and as a friend and member of a family. So we'll start with number 1. Christianity is not compatible with cancel culture. At the beginning of his encyclical, Pope Francis writes, "I offer this letter as a modest contribution to a continued reflection, in the hope that in the face of present-day attempts to eliminate or ignore others, we may prove capable of responding with a new vision of fraternity and social friendship that will not remain at the level of words." I find the phenomenon of cancel culture an affront to human dignity and a way to dodge meaningful debate. Cancel culture essentially involves withdrawing support or publicly shaming someone for behavior or thinking that is characterized as offensive, embarrassing, or problematic. And we're seeing it more and more, not only with our public figures and leaders, but with ordinary people. Cancel culture essentially says, you are not worthy of existing. You are not worthy of being seen or heard. You are not welcome as a member of the human family. And I say very seriously that anyone who purports to uphold human dignity or propose policies in which human dignity should be cherished or protected has to reject cancel culture. Again, let's hear from Pope Francis. He says we should never confine others to what they may have said or done, but value them for the promise that they embody, a promise that brings with it a spark of hope. Another way of saying this is you're not the worst thing you've done in your life. Nobody's the worst thing that they've done in their life. No matter how grievous someone's actions or words might be, or how wrong we might think their viewpoint is, no matter how offensive we understand them to be, a Christian cannot cancel. We have to do everything we can to reach out to them, to understand them, to persuade them to consider things in a different light. A Christian is someone who offers empathy, which in other words is helping other people feel felt. As Christians, we have Jesus's example in the gospel to guide us. Every person has a desire to be seen, to be chosen, and to be cherished. Jesus approaches even the greatest sinners with gentleness. He sits with them, he looks at them, and he listens to them. There's nothing more opposed to canceling or shunning than his example in the gospel. Think of the woman at the well, or St. Matthew, the tax collector, or even the good thief hanging next to him on the cross. And though these aren't his exact words, I feel confident Pope Francis would encourage us to pause before we say something or post something that would be characterized as canceling. Of our technological platforms, he says, a mechanism of selection comes into play where I can immediately separate likes from dislikes, what is attractive from what I think is attractive from what is distasteful. In the same way, we can choose the people who we share our world with. Persons or situations we find unpleasant or disagreeable are simply deleted in today's virtual networks. A circle is created, isolating us from the real world in which we're living. I'm not sort of, as I was telling the campus ministry staff, the best millennial or best representative millennial in that I'm not always adept at technologies, but I do know the power of muting, the power of deleting someone from your feed. We know that the algorithms of our technologies are just putting like-minded people in our path, and the technologies often, especially certain platforms, reward sort of this cancel culture language, which is really quite destructive. So we want to avoid canceling. Number 2, all political conversations should start with the question that Jesus poses in the gospel: what do you seek? The state of our political conversation and debates, if you can even call them that, or our ability to articulate our arguments, is kind of pitiful. Don't take it from me. Listen again to Pope Francis. Political life no longer has to do with healthy debates about long-term plans to improve people's lives or advance the common good, but only with slick marketing techniques aimed at discrediting others. In this craven exchange of chargers and counterchargers, debate degenerates into a permanent state of disagreement and confrontation. As any student of Civ knows, politics is the science of how a society should flourish and how it should be structured in order for people to flourish. And we all know this from Aristotle's Politics. It's about helping people to develop integrally, as Pope Francis says, or to develop all aspects of their humanity, from their physical health to their relationships, to their moral growth and development, to their economic prosperity, and as Christians, we believe, hopefully, their sanctity. St. John Paul II says that a good society is one in which it's easy for citizens to be good. There should be spirited debate on campus and in your lives generally about how to form that society, not snide remarks or superficial spewing of talking points. And unfortunately, we don't have many adults, many leaders who are able to model that for us. So you have to find people on campus, especially who you respect, who are doing that. When having political conversations, I recommend starting with Jesus's question, what do you seek? In other words, ask by espousing that policy idea or political viewpoint, what is the good that you're trying to promote? What is it that you value? When discussions get back to values, chances are two political opponents will realize they actually share something in common, even if they just have a different way of believing how it can be brought about, or different arguments as to what path is better to bring it about. This is not to say that there aren't real substantive differences about what is good, but I think more Americans than not, and probably more people on campus and on our TV and debate stages, share things in common. We can get into some examples of that maybe in Q&A. The master of this, apart from Jesus, and this should come as no surprise to folks, is St. Thomas Aquinas. If you think about the Summa, it's out of love for his brothers and sisters that St. Thomas Aquinas spills so much ink articulating their understandable objections to a point he would eventually make. This was not some sort of intellectual game or a way to shame people who would raise sort of questions, but it's a way in which he sort of crawls up into his opponents' or objectors' minds and hearts and demonstrates empathy for what they are seeking. Pope Francis would laud this as he says, we have to stand in the place of others if we are to discover what is genuine, or at least understandable in their motivations or concerns. You might not agree with your political opponent in the end, but you will understand what they value, and that ultimately is a good thing. Number 3, have a person first, not party first approach. A major shift in our cultural approach to the person is identity politics, or more broadly, identity formation. There seems to be pressure for individuals at younger and younger ages. This was, again, not present when I was in school as much, to pick certain identifiers and affiliations from a very long menu, and then to cobble together one sense of self, or a self that we project into the world, either on campus or on social media. Maybe it happened back in the day. Someone would say, you know, I'm a member of campus ministry, or I'm on BOP. And with that kind of came a larger idea of group identity. But it certainly there wasn't this long list or a real pressure to commit to things. On the positive side of that inclination to belong to a group, it follows the natural inclination towards togetherness. We are communal people. But on the negative side, it's creating an us versus them mentality in which lines are sort of definitively drawn as to who is in and who is out. And so when we begin with political discussions, we often start with a party affiliation and make a host of assumptions about what that person must believe, value, or be like. But this is insufficient, especially for a Christian approach. The person with whom I'm engaging in a debate is someone with a history, personal experiences, a particular family of origin, and from the Christian perspective, they're a daughter or son of God, my brother or sister, with a unique mission that God has entrusted for them in the world. The person-first approach is to say, as hard as it might be, that each person is deeply loved by God. This means that Donald Trump is deeply loved by God. Joe Biden is deeply loved by God. Kamala Harris is deeply loved by God, Mike Pence, and so on and so on. It is also important to remember that some people hold beliefs because they're convinced by intellectual argument or study. And you might be engaging in debates with people about real sort of, the real meat of political science. But many times people espouse beliefs because they are deeply personal to them, and they are reflected in people's personal history or experience. And so the sort of party first affiliation might fall short. Pope Francis encourages us to assume the best in people, that they are following their conscience as best as they know how. He writes, "The effort to seek God with a sincere heart, provided it is never sullied by ideological or self-serving aims, helps us to recognize one another as traveling companions, truly brothers and sisters." The last thing I'd say about this point is that our own identity is rooted above all in the same reality, that we are children of God. And this label trumps all of our own other identifiers. And that should give us the freedom to love in ways that break the boundaries that our culture is setting and these us versus them lines. Pope Francis spends a whole lot of time in this encyclical using the example of the Good Samaritan to shape us. And he says that the Good Samaritan didn't fit into any of the categories of his day that would have been important in the parable. He says he was simply a foreigner without a place, free of every label and position. He was able to interrupt his journey, change his plans, and unexpectedly come to the aid of an injured person who needed his help. So again, I encourage you to go to the encyclical and read more. But the idea is because his fundamental identity wasn't tied down by so many of these accidental things, he was able to love, which is our most important thing to do. Especially in this strange time and intense time. The fourth point I would say Pope Francis would suggest is to become a better communicator. And I think that's a key part of kind of overcoming our current difficulties, and not just because this is an area that I'm a professional in, but it's often because I'm the one at the holiday table explaining something about the church, usually answering questions about her moral teachings or the intersection of the Catholic faith and political engagement. I have to say it's easier for me to talk to reporters, the New York Times or the Washington Post, than to family members who vehemently disagree with one of my deeply held convictions. But Pope Francis insists that we all, no matter our circumstances, get better at three things. The first is dialogue, the second is encounter, and the third, and most important, is listening. So first, what is dialogue? Far from being some wishy-washy substitute for can't we all just get along or pick the lowest common denominator thing to agree on, he says dialogue requires the hard work of approaching, speaking, listening, looking at, and coming to know and understand one another, and to find common ground. In order to dialogue, we cannot approach something, a debate, or someone, our opponent, with our back up, ready to fight. We have to approach them with openness, which also requires humility. At the same time, we are required, when we are dialoguing, to know our position, to know what it is that we believe or what our views are up and down. And as an aside, this takes real time, research, study. It takes prayer and a lot of thought. Pope Francis says when individuals and groups are consistent in their thinking, defend their values and convictions, and develop their arguments, this surely benefits society. So we are encouraged to know what it is that we believe or espouse and why, not just to repeat talking points or to necessarily follow the party line down the line. Two people whose writing I really like to read, historian David Mccullough. I believe he spoke at Providence a few years ago. It might be more than a few years ago. As I said, I'm feeling fairly old here. And Wall Street Journal columnist Peggy Noonan both have given this advice to graduating seniors in commencement speeches. And it's just 3 words: read whole books. They say to students to read history and a lot of it, to read literature and a lot of it, and to read poetry and a lot of it, to consider how people in the past have thought about what the good life constitutes, how to order society, and basically how to get along or how to fight well. As an aside, when I was at Catholic University of America, I had to introduce Peggy Noonan. She was delivering the commencement address that year. And she said that, a lot of politicians seem to know the movie version of American history, but they don't even know sort of the book version or the historical version. And she encouraged our generation and the generation that was graduating to be better, to know who we are as Americans. And I would add, as Christians, if we're a Christian or whatever our faith tradition is well. Pope Francis adds to this the idea that sort of the state of knowledge right now is really superficial, and we have to fight against that. This is working against having a society where more people are living in communion and in harmony. He says the flood of information at our fingertips does not make for greater wisdom. Wisdom is not born of quick searches on the internet or a mass of unverified data. That is not the way to mature in our encounter with truth. Conversations revolve today only around the latest data. They become merely horizontal and cumulative. When we fail to keep our attention focused and to penetrate to the heart of matters, we fail to recognize what is essential in giving meaning to our lives. So let's turn to encounter. Encounter revolves getting offline. And I realize this is really difficult and kind of ironic as we're on Zoom and you're not able to gather as you want to. But if you are able to gather safely, or when you're able to gather safely, keep this in mind. Pope Francis says this about social media. Digital media can expose people to the risk of addiction, isolation, and a gradual loss of contact with concrete reality, blocking the development of interpersonal relationships. These types of communications on the online lack physical gestures, facial expressions, moments of silence, body language, and even the smells, trembling hands, blushes, and perspiration that speak to us and are a part of human communication. Real dialogue, real friendship, real intimacy, and even real debate can only really be done in person because this is how we were made. Authentic communication, and remember that communication has the same root in terms of etymology as communion, which is meant to bring people together, has to take place face-to-face and heart-to-heart. If your online conversations are escalating or gossip is mounting, pivot towards talking face-to-face, obviously with masks and social distancing rules applying. And the third is kind of interesting. He says we need to get better at listening. It's really not just about us talking, but it's about us listening. A friend of mine who's a licensed therapist has shared with me a practice she teaches to couples in therapy. It's called active listening. We've kind of seen this probably in movies, parodied, but it's actually a really helpful tool, she says. The person speaking asks that the listener repeats back what the listener heard. So what's telling is not only that the listener shares what was said, but probably more often than not, what that person heard. My husband and I got this advice from a bishop I used to work for, and he said, we asked for advice for married couples, and he shared this. He said, there's two lines. It's what did I say and what did you hear me say? That would guide us through the rest of our marriage. And we put that into place more often than not. So active listening demonstrates that you acknowledge or come to an understanding of what was said. You kind of get on the table what you heard, and you then get back to what the other person was trying to share. It helps the speaker feel understood and valued and make sure that the listener was listening. Pope Francis thinks we do this poorly today, and though he has a long quote, he says, essentially, today's world is largely deaf. Halfway through someone speaking, we interrupt them, contradict what he has said when he has not even finished, and we cannot lose our ability to listen. Obviously, our culture kind of has this frenzied pace of consuming information and of texting back. I don't know how many conversations online or on your phone you have to maintain at one given time, but it's exhausting and works against, or makes it harder, I should say, to do this active listening. So it's a habit that we have to form and practice, but it's very important. And the fifth thing I would say is that ultimately life is about witnessing, not winning. Someone who espouses political views that upholds human dignity, but treats people who disagree with them terribly, is frankly what Jesus calls a hypocrite. In the root word, hypocrite means that you're an actor. And as Christians, we don't want to be play acting. We want, as Jesus says, our yes to mean yes and our no to mean no. Maybe the most important thing to remember tonight, and as we enter this last week before a presidential election, is that people always remember more how you made them feel than what you said. Again, Pope Francis says, St. Thomas Aquinas sought to describe the love made possible by God's grace as a movement outwards towards another, whereby we consider the beloved as somehow united to ourselves. Our affection for others makes us freely seek their good. So whenever you're engaging in debate, remember that the witness you give is more important than winning the argument. It's probably going to feel satisfying to best someone in a political discussion or to even win them over to your side, if you could. But it will ultimately, it will be more longer lasting, and it will feel better if you leave a conversation having moved them closer to the ultimate truth that we all seek by the way that you engaged in the debate. And that truth we know is Jesus, who is the way, the truth, and the life. I'll close with two thoughts. The first is that I really recommend taking advantage of the time you have on Providence College's campus. It's probably one of the few remaining places and times in which you will live, eat, sleep, pray, study, and recreate with people who are different from you. As I said, our neighborhoods are changing, our churches are even changing. God has providentially put you all in each other's path for your enrichment. And PC's commitment to truth, beauty, and goodness attracts all sorts of people, and the place is better for it. So soak up this opportunity because it doesn't last forever. And the second thing I would say, I've talked a lot about Pope Francis tonight, and someone he mentioned when he came to the United States and spoke to Congress was the great saint in the making, Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic Worker Movement. And she once wrote, I recommend everything she's ever written, but she once wrote, I only love God as much as the person I love the least. And as hard as it is to sit with that, it's very true, and obviously rooted in the scriptures. So that's something to keep in mind. How am I treating the person whose political views or personality I hate the least? Because that's how much I love God. Something to keep in mind this election season. So those are 5 tips, mostly from Pope Francis here, and a little St. Thomas Aquinas I couldn't resist, to hopefully guide you through this last week and beyond. Thank you, and I think there are somehow questions getting to me now.
Yes, so thank you, Elise, very much for your beautiful presentation and reflections on friendship in light of Pope Francis's recent encyclical. One question that's come in is, do you think the general lack of concern for human dignity, so we could think of things like wholesale violence in movies and video games, homelessness, abortion, pornography, and so on, do you think the lack of concern for human dignity reflected by these things contributes to the increase in the divide in our society?
So that the wholesale espousal would contribute to a divide?
Well, just the sort of what is often perceived as the kind of general lack of concern for human dignity. And those are some examples that you could point to, but just the kind of general trend that seems like there are many ways where society is less concerned with human dignity than it should be. Do you think that contributes to what seems to be the increasing divide?
Sure. Well, I would say, I mean, on the one hand, it's easy to be pessimistic. And if we do take stock, as the person who submitted the question says, in addition to sort of the hot button political issues, I think there are a lot of issues where human dignity is being attacked or violated that would cross political platforms. And I think one thing we should work towards is identifying those common areas where independent of party or independent of preference, we could come together and move things along. You know, people are never going to agree, at least in the next sort of immediate future. I would say parties aren't always going to agree on all of the really polarizing and hot button issues, but as you said, there are certain things that we should be able to join hands together and move forward. I would say that there is, just to underscore this, there is a general, on the one hand, there is a general disregard for human dignity. And because of technology, film, social media, a lot of this is in our sights. We're sort of taking in this, and I think that contributes to a great amount of anger, worry, anxiety. But on the flip side, I would encourage people to fill their time and their screen time seeking out the really beautiful ways that human dignity is being upheld. A couple sisters come to mind, the Sisters of Life. There's a lot of beautiful imagery about young sisters accompanying women who find themselves in crisis pregnancies. I think about Sister Norma Pimentel, who's down at the border, and she's sharing beautiful videos about the migrants and the refugees she encounters, celebrating birthdays, kind of providing them with dignity. So I would encourage students, for as much negative news as you consume or hard things that you watch, seek out something more beautiful. Maybe it's online, or maybe it's, again, like I said, poetry or history that uplifts you.
Thank you. So you spoke a bit at the beginning about cancel culture, and you said that Christians don't cancel, which is a very striking, very striking point. Do you think that there is a tendency today to cancel past culture? And if so, is this problematic? And how ought we to view the past, even in its more troubling aspects?
Sure. I'm grateful for this question. I think it's an important question that we as Americans are asking ourselves right now. This is not what I do in my spare time generally, but for work, I guess sometimes I do, but for work, I was reading a passage that the Vatican passed. It was an international conference it took place on human rights in South Africa. This took place under the papacy of Pope Benedict. And I was reading on themes of the purification of memory. And I would say that there are movements right now underway to erase painful past. I mean, there are certain things that we're addressing in terms of, I want to make distinctions between questions about who we have elevated in our culture in terms of monuments, but then also the movement to maybe not make that distinction and to begin erasing things that have been troublesome in the past. Pope Francis in this encyclical, and again, Pope Benedict, and I would also wager, I can't think of there's a book called Memory and Identity that John Paul II shared, that say that the church is behind the idea of the purification of memory. And ultimately that means not erasing, just like sort of similar to confession, or actually similar to the process of forgiving, I would say. One does not forget the wrong. The wrong kind of stays as an instructive teacher, but we release together sort of the bonds that pain has over us in order to be reconciled to one another. That process is very complicated. I think the church has backed largely movements like the post-apartheid attempts for reconciliation and justice, or truth and reconciliation. Again, South Africa's instructed. I would also recommend to students, if you're asking, the book Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson, about sort of the issues right now with mass incarceration. His work with the Equal Justice Initiative, he is a Christian man, and he ultimately talks about bringing the truth of our past out through education, through conversations. He's doing some really interesting things in southern towns where there were lynchings, uniting the families of those who committed the lynchings and those who were lynched. They come together. And so their memory is purified by knowing the truth, but then setting each other free as a moment of peace. So it's very complicated, but those are sort of themes that I think the church has embraced and are obviously rooted in the gospel.
Sorry, I think I may have frozen there for a second. Are you still there with us? Okay. Okay. So the next question. Sorry for that little technical difficulty there. How do we face and endure conversations with those who not only disagree with our opinions, but who don't value others' existence and value? In other words, what do we do when the disagreement is much deeper than the level of opinion, but actually has more to do with worldview and how we see other people and their value?
Sure. I think there are topics that are, there are moral issues for sure that sort of, I mean, politics is about ordering society, but ultimately I think the hottest button questions are about moral issues, which have to do with how we see each other, how we see the good, and sort of who counts when it comes to protecting human life. I think employing the communication tools that I shared are one way to start. But I would also go back to two things. I would say Pope Francis says, at the end of the day, as Christians, when it comes to moral claims, it's not sufficient to say everybody can kind of go their separate ways. At some point, there is something that is true. The church professes that it has the truth in Jesus Christ. She's not always the best in the way that she communicates that, or is not always consistent, but it's there. And so this is not to say we can all kind of get along or we just agree to disagree. So the one thing is that it's important to remember when it comes to moral claims, there are things that are true. At the same time, I think Jesus's approach in the gospel, this was the reading from a few weeks ago, the gospel reading. It's about this principle of fraternal correction. And it's meant to be, lived out within the context of the church. But I think it could be applied more broadly. And the notion is that Jesus doesn't say to the disciples, if someone does something wrong or is promoting something wrong or doing something bad, you don't go shame them publicly. The first thing you do is don't post online, I think he would say, or shout it from the rooftops. You go directly to that person and you have an intimate conversation and you try to help them see. And then if they don't agree, you bring a few more like-minded people. And at the end of the day, you might have to say, well, they are refusing to see, or there's hardness of heart or a blind spot. And I think at that point, that's where prayer comes in. It's not enough to just argue, for this person to see, the truth, but then you turn it over to God, that this is God's child, daughter or son. And at the end of the day, this is something that they have to work out. And again, the most important thing is how you treat them. If you are consistent with the manner in which you're speaking, the truth that you're articulating for, and the way that you're treating with them, sometimes that's kind of what you just offer to God.
So, we've been speaking about finding common ground with others who we disagree with. Could you say a bit more about the distinction between finding common ground with someone and just trying to convince them of your position? It seems like, necessary to being friends with someone who disagrees with you is to find something upon which you agree. But sometimes the default mode of doing that is just to try to convince the other person that they're wrong and you're right. So
Sure.
Can you say a bit more about kind of how to navigate that tricky
Sure.
distinction?
I'm going to take a hard example. I hope it's okay. And maybe this will illustrate things. So let's say the topic of abortion were to come up in a discussion. The church is going to articulate firmly, fervently, with great compassion and passion, that all human beings are worthy of protection, that there are no rights if the fundamental right to life is not upheld, and that women who find themselves in crisis pregnancy should be fully accompanied and supported with all sorts of economic support, spiritual support, etc. It's a very consistent approach, at least in theory. If there's a debate about pro-life or pro-choice on campus, let's say, I would encourage the folks in terms of sort of a political discussion to ask again the question of what do you seek? And I think at the end of the day, this is a caricature again, people are not just parties or party positions. Someone who is arguing for a pro-choice position will probably generally place emphasis on, the support for a woman who finds herself in a terrifying situation, who might not have the resources, the support to bring this child into the world. And so the emphasis and the value is on protecting women and sort of upholding them in times of difficulty. The pro-life person should be able to say, I also espouse that value. I believe, though, that, and I would argue through whatever research I've provided or experience, that the best way to support that woman would not be to add more burdens, more violence, or something that is going to further wound her, but to carry this term. And so you'd come to realize that you actually both support. It's not necessarily pitting child against mother. It's saying, how do we support all of the people involved in this decision? I also, the pro-life person could say, support the woman. So it's getting again to a common value then understanding the distinctions that you're making apart from
that. You mentioned very strikingly Pope Francis's statement in this encyclical that he has a kind of vision of friendship and of fraternity that does not remain at the level of words. So what might that look like? How do we seek this in our lives? Do you have any sort of practical tips for inculcating this kind of friendship that won't remain at the level of words, especially with those who, we might want to exchange words with about the things we disagree with?
Right. I mean, the immediate thing that comes to mind is, again, get offline. I think I had the privilege of coming of age and being in college, like I said, before friend became a verb. Facebook, I think, started my junior year, and we were all really gun shy about whether or not this was a good idea. Father Peter Martyr and I are the same age. I can see him shaking. And our parents weren't on there. And anyway, there's a whole host of positive things about it at the time. But I think about my college roommates and my dear friend, people who have been bridesmaids in my wedding and vice versa. And we, if I were just basing them on their political affiliation at the time, or their sports affiliation, or their Instagram account, and now I understand there's you can have multiple Instagram accounts. I don't know. I don't even know what to say. The point is, we forged our friendships in person. And Pope Francis is saying, in order to, and again, these friends and I have different cultural interests. We probably vote differently, but we are deeply entwined in one another's lives because we spent the time making a history, making memories, having those conversations about what we were studying in person. So I just, again, go back to put your phone down. I think this is a particular moment. My husband and I were talking the other day about how we think we'll look back, in 10 or 20 years, or maybe 50 years, and we will realize how our consumption of media was so bad for us. And we will hopefully, as a culture, have taken steps to reduce it or moderate it, to preserve these types of relationships and to grow them. It can be done. You just have to put your phone away.
You spoke about Pope Francis sharing the need to be consistent in our thinking. Could you speak a bit more about what that might mean and what this looks like? Perhaps this has something to do with, what you mentioned, David Mccullough and Peggy Noonan encouraging people to read whole books and to think deeply about the implications and consequences of positions they hold. But just this idea of being consistent in your thinking, could you just say a bit more about how we could be better about trying to do that?
Sure. I'm partial as a Catholic to speaking to Dominicans here in a Catholic campus, but to studying the Church, not just in her moral teachings, but in the literature she elevates from all cultures, in her history. And so I mentioned Dorothy Day. She studied theology, but she spent most of her time reading Dickens and other sort of great sort of literary authors, because she said that's how, if I want to be interested in the human being, I have to read authors who understood human nature. And so her sort of moral development happened through a great deal of reading and mostly literature. I would say, though, that one troubling thing is trying to map our Catholicism onto the American political system. There are philosophers, some famous one at Notre Dame comes to mind, some other ones who have argued that, there is a moment in which what Catholicism embodies, or Christianity embodies, and what, I'd say Catholicism more, and the American project, they come to a point where there's not necessarily an overlap. Christianity has existed in the Roman Empire. It's existed in monarchies. It exists in underground churches in Asia. The fact that our Catholicism doesn't map onto the Democratic Party or the Republican Party should not be a surprise to us who study global Catholicism or understand our history. So I would encourage you, if your faith is important to you, to look at the wholeness of what the Church teaches. to look at what your party might subscribe to or what you place emphasis on, and realize that they're not always going to be reconciled, and that's sort of shy of the kingdom of God. We're kind of using sort of our best, they're not guesses, because obviously we're forming our consciences, but we're doing the best we can. And I would say go back to that list of identifiers. Do you see yourself first fundamentally as a child of God, and what are the implications for what he asked you to, how he asked you to treat human beings, how he asked you to treat creation, and think first in terms of your sort of fundamental identifiers, and secondly in terms of your political ones.
So in the theme and the spirit of thinking deeply and broadly, do you see a role for art in fostering some of these civic virtues like dialogue, encounter, and listening? And if so, do you think that we are steeped in art enough? What are some art forms or kinds of art, or even individual works of art that would be helpful for uniting us in these values of dialogue and encounter and trust and listening?
My art history professors at Providence would be probably mortified that I'm stunned at particular works of art. Something more contemporary comes to mind. During this time of pandemic, on Twitter, one of my favorite musicians, Yo-Yo Ma, started playing what he called were songs of comfort. And he picked from his Rolodex of Bach and Dvorak and other composers. He picked contemporary musicians, and he just started playing for people. And I don't know how Yo-Yo Ma, might vote in the upcoming presidential election, but he cared that people were suffering. They were locked in their homes. They were scared of a virus, and he put something beautiful in front of them. Patrick Stewart, I think of one of the Star Trek fames, the actor, started reading all of Shakespeare's sonnets from Zoom. And this gained like a huge following during COVID. And so I would say I don't have specific art forms necessarily. I also listened to a lecture during COVID by the poet Dana Gioia, who's out in California. He's a Catholic. He writes in a lot of publications. He has beautiful poetry. And he just talked about the importance in all of the hustle and bustle of our lives. This virus has slowed us down and kind of forced us to confront things. And he said, start memorizing poetry. It's kind of a way to focus you on what's important. And in terms of poetry, he said that there's the use of so few words. We're constantly talking, constantly typing, constantly retweeting. Poetry has a way of focusing us on what is most important in its simplicity. So I don't have specific things, but I say yes to more art. The last thing I would say is I grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and Philadelphia is known as a town for a lot of murals in the city. And I would say even that kind of art, it's not necessarily high. We would say it's high, but it's beautiful and thought-provoking, and the expression of sort of the groanings of people's hearts. So there's beauty all around. You're on a beautiful campus with a lot of beautiful art. Just stop and contemplate. I don't know if it produces common ground, but it might produce the common experience of being in awe together.
Thank you for listening to the Providence College podcast. Episodes are available in all of the usual places, as well as the college's YouTube channel and on your smart speaker. For producer Chris Judge, I'm Liz Kay. Until next time.